52 million American adults reported significant loneliness in a February 2023 Gallup poll. By September 2024, that figure had climbed again. 1 in 5 U.S. adults now reports feeling lonely every single day, according to Gallup's quarterly tracking. The U.S. Surgeon General's 2023 advisory, an 82-page document published by the Department of Health and Human Services, found that approximately half of American adults had reported measurable levels of loneliness even before COVID-19 arrived. In 2003, American adults spent an average of 5.5 hours per week socializing with others in person. By 2024, that number had fallen to 35 minutes per day, a decline of roughly 30% across 2 decades, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics' American Time Use Survey. For Americans aged 15 to 25, the decline is steeper. In 2003, that age group averaged 61 minutes of daily in-person socializing. By 2019, before any pandemic disruption, it had already dropped to 39 minutes. It has not recovered. According to an October 2023 Pew Research poll, 8% of Americans report having no close friends at all. A 2024 report from the American Enterprise Institute Survey Center on American Life, authored by researchers Daniel Cox and Samuel Pressler, found that 17% of Americans now report having no close friendships, up from 12% in 2021. A Harvard Graduate School of Education survey conducted in May 2024 through the Making Caring Common project found that of adults who identified as lonely, 65% described feeling fundamentally separate or disconnected from others or the world, and 57% said they were unable to share their true selves with anyone around them. A Cigna national survey found that nearly 3 in 5 Americans say no one truly knows them. The numbers describe an absence, but they do not yet describe its shape. There is a specific kind of loneliness that the public conversation keeps misidentifying. The dominant framing in policy documents, in Surgeon General advisories, and public health campaigns treats loneliness primarily as a deficit of quantity. Not enough people, not enough contact, not enough time in the same room with other human beings. That framing is not wrong. It is incomplete. Sociologist Robert Weiss first articulated the distinction in 1973 in his book Loneliness, The Experience of Emotional and Social Isolation. Weiss argued that loneliness does not arise simply from the absence of people. It arises from the absence of specific relational provisions, 6 categories of what social relationships are supposed to supply: attachment, social integration, the opportunity to provide nurturance, reassurance of worth, a sense of reliable alliance, and access to guidance. Weiss's observation, which has since been validated across decades of empirical work, was that people who appear socially embedded, married, employed, surrounded by family, can nonetheless be profoundly lonely if their relationships are failing to supply these provisions. His early case studies included what he described as lonely wives with loving husbands, no observable social deficits, complete relational poverty. That observation became the structural frame for understanding what the current data is measuring, and the current data is measuring something considerably more troubling than the friendship count statistics suggest. The 2024 Harvard Making Caring Common survey, a nationally representative sample conducted by researchers Milena Batonova, Richard Weisbord, and Joseph McIntyre, found that the loneliness Americans describe is frequently not the loneliness of empty rooms. One survey respondent described having plenty of family members around, but not feeling appreciated by them. Another described being surrounded by other people who only are present in my life because I am useful to them. These are not socially isolated individuals by any metric the public health literature conventionally uses. They are not friendless. They are not hermits. They are people who exist inside relationships that do not, in any meaningful sense, know them. This distinction between being present in someone's life and being actually known by them is the specific phenomenon that the aggregate loneliness statistics keep failing to capture cleanly, and it is the phenomenon that appears to be worsening at a faster rate than the headline numbers suggest. Understanding why this particular form of loneliness is intensifying requires examining what has changed about the infrastructure of social life since the mid-20th century. Robert Putnam's 2000 book, Bowling Alone, documented the collapse of civic associational life in America, the decline of bowling leagues, PTAs, labor unions, church attendance, neighborhood associations, the kinds of institutions that forced people into repeated, unscheduled contact with others who were not pre-selected for compatibility. Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist at New York University's Stern Business School, has described the implications in blunt terms. If you thought things were bad when Bob Putnam wrote Bowling Alone, my God, things are so much worse now. The mechanism Haidt is describing is not simply declining social contact. It is the disappearance of what sociologist Mark Granovetter, in his foundational paper of 1973, The Strength of Weak Ties, called weak ties. The acquaintances, the neighbors, the regulars at the same diner, the people encountered repeatedly in the ordinary friction of shared civic space. Weak ties are not intimate relationships. They are, however, the scaffolding on which intimate relationships are built. They are also, and this is the piece that most contemporary loneliness discourse underweights, intrinsically knowledge-generating. Repeated, low-stakes contact with the same person across time and context is precisely what allows them to build a genuine model of who you are. The institutions that generated this kind of contact have been in decades-long decline. American Time Use Survey data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that between 2003 and 2019, before any pandemic disruption accelerated the trend, the fraction of free time Americans spent with people from other households declined from 21.9% to 17.3%, a 4.6 percentage point drop according to research by Federal Reserve economist Enhin Atalay, published by the Philadelphia Fed in 2022. The largest declines were concentrated among people who had never attended college, from low-income households, and among non-white Americans. The social infrastructure erosion is not evenly distributed. It is tracking the existing fault lines of American inequality with considerable precision. What replaced it is a specific architectural feature of contemporary social life that is almost never named directly in the loneliness literature. Highly curated, algorithmically structured social contact that maximizes surface-level presence while systematically minimizing the conditions under which genuine knowledge of another person can develop. If this script is connecting with how you think about these questions, consider subscribing. This kind of deep dive research takes time, and the channel runs on the support of people who take ideas seriously. Social media platforms, as of 2024, are used by approximately 5.2 billion people globally. The average American spends multiple hours per day on these platforms. The average American teenager, according to data cited in the 2024 Harvard Making Caring Common report, spends more time in passive digital consumption than in any form of in-person social activity. The loneliness research on social media use presents a pattern that is more specific than the common "social media is bad for you" narrative suggests. A study led by Brian Primack, professor at Oregon State University's College of Health, and published in Public Health Reports in 2024, drawing on data from summer 2023, supported by the National Institutes of Health, found that social media connections with strangers provided essentially no relief from loneliness, and that people experiencing loneliness who prioritized social media interactions over in-person ones showed no meaningful improvement in their condition. Primack's precise finding was that People experiencing loneliness may wish to examine critically their interactions with strangers on social media and to prioritize in-person connections over social media ones, even when those social media connections are considered close. The qualifier, even when considered close, is doing significant analytical work. Premack is not describing the obvious case of superficial digital acquaintances. He is describing relationships that the participants themselves categorize as meaningful. A 2025 study published in Open Media and Communications found that parasocial relationships with social media influencers, the one-directional emotional bonds that followers develop with content creators, were positively correlated with loneliness rather than reducing it. Researchers identified what they called an illusion of social interaction. The brain perceives connection, but the experience does not change how people evaluate their own social needs. The relationship appears intimate. The relationship contains no mutual knowledge. A separate 2023 study published in PLOS One, drawing on data from a Japanese online community platform for older adults and using path analysis on 819 participants, found what it described as a paradoxical finding. Having more mutual followers on a social platform was directly associated with greater loneliness when the following was devoid of meaningful engagement. More contact, less knowledge, more loneliness. The pattern holds across demographic groups, across platforms, across methodologies. What the data is consistently pointing toward is not that digital connection fails to replicate in-person connection. It is pointing towards something structurally different. Digital social architectures are optimized for visibility, not legibility. They are designed to make people seen, not known. This is a distinction the loneliness research keeps circling without quite landing on directly, possibly because it requires engaging with what being known actually entails. And that question leads into territory that is considerably more complicated than public health framing is typically comfortable with. Psychologist Arthur Aaron at Stony Brook University spent much of his career studying how closeness develops between people. His 1997 study, The Experimental Generation of Interpersonal Closeness, published in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, demonstrated that structured, mutual self-disclosure, specifically the graduated exchange of increasingly personal information, could produce measurable feelings of closeness in strangers within 45 minutes. The study is famous. What is less often cited is what it implies, that the mechanism of closeness is not time, not proximity, not shared experience alone. It is the structured, graduated, reciprocal revelation of self. Aaron's finding connects directly to what University of Virginia psychologist Megan Costello and colleagues documented in a 2024 study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, tracking a diverse community sample of 184 participants from ages 13 to 29 in annual observed interactions with close friends and romantic partners. The study found that vulnerable self-disclosure, the willingness to share what is genuinely at risk, genuinely uncertain, genuinely private, functions as what the researchers call an active ingredient in the formation of intimacy. When that ingredient is absent, relationships can be warm, consistent, even pleasurable, without producing the experience of being known. The friendship exists, the knowledge does not accumulate. The structural barrier to this process in contemporary social life is not, as it is frequently framed, purely psychological. It is not that people are too guarded or too scared. The Natalie Pennington-led American Friendship Project, an ongoing multi-year survey published in PLOS One in July 2024, drawing on data from nearly 6,000 American adults gathered in 2022 and 2023, found that 42% of Americans report that they are not as close to their friends as they would like to be. Among those with friends, 23% of their friendships are categorized as casual rather than close. The gap between the relationships people have and the relationships people want is not a gap in desire or even in intention. It is a gap in the structural conditions that allow knowledge to develop. What are those structural conditions? Across multiple research traditions, the answer converges on three elements: time, repetition, and context diversity. Encountering the same person at work and at a party and in a crisis and in a moment of boredom. Each context reveals something the others obscure. Each repetition updates the mental model. Over time, the aggregate of these encounters produces something that can genuinely be called knowledge of another person. American life, since at least the 1990s, but with dramatic acceleration in the smartphone era, has been systematically reducing all three of these elements simultaneously. People have less unstructured time, social contact is increasingly intentional and scheduled rather than incidental and repeated, and context diversity in social settings has collapsed as work, leisure, civic life, and domestic life have separated into more sealed compartments, each populated by different subsets of the same person's social world, none of which overlap enough to produce a composite picture. This is the kind of research that doesn't show up in a tweet. If you want the full argument, watch to the end. And if you found this channel through someone who shared it, consider subscribing. There is precedent for this specific configuration of conditions. Sociologist Emil Durkheim, writing in 1897 in Suicide, identified what he called anomie, a condition produced not by poverty or despair, but by the dissolution of social norms and bonds that anchor an individual to a community with shared expectations. Durkheim's anomic individuals were not necessarily isolated. Many were embedded in social structures. What they lacked was the density of mutual obligation and mutual knowledge that makes those structures meaningful. His data showed that suicide rates were higher in Protestant populations than Catholic ones, not because of theology, but because Protestantism's emphasis on individual interpretation had eroded the dense community bonds that Catholicism's institutional structures maintained. The individuals were present, the community did not know them. Durkheim's analysis was structural, not moral. It was about the architecture of social life producing or failing to produce genuine integration. His data predicted that when those architectural conditions deteriorated, the subjective experience of isolation would follow, even among people who remained technically embedded in social groups. The parallel to the present moment is not decorative. The Bureau of Labor Statistics' American Time Use Survey data shows that between 2003 and 2019, the fraction of free time Americans spent socializing with people outside their own household declined from 21.9% to 17.3%. When controlling for changes in work hours, the remaining decline correlates strongly with the adoption of smartphone technology and the shift of social interaction from spontaneous, repeated, context-diverse encounters to planned, infrequent, context-thin ones. The architecture of social life has changed in ways that structurally reduce the conditions under which genuine knowledge of other people develops, while simultaneously maintaining and, in some metrics, increasing the surface-level count of social contacts. Durkheim could not have described a more precisely anomic configuration if he had tried. The historical parallel that may be even more instructive than Durkheim, however, is the period of rapid urbanization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when millions of Americans moved from small, context-dense rural communities, where people encountered the same individuals across every domain of life, into large cities, where social life became compartmentalized, specialized, and voluntarily constructed rather than structurally imposed. The social theorist Zimmel wrote in 1903 in The Metropolis and Mental Life that urban social life required a specific psychological adaptation he called the blasé attitude, a protective numbness to the relentless stimulation of too much contact with too many people, most of whom were strangers. Zimmel's Metropolis produced abundance of contact and poverty of knowledge simultaneously. The difference between Zimmel's 1903 city and the present condition is that the 1903 city at least preserved dense neighborhood structures, ethnic enclaves, religious institutions, and labor organizations that created the conditions for genuine knowledge of a bounded set of people. The present configuration has, in significant measure, eroded even those residual structures, while adding a new layer of simulated connection that creates the phenomenological sensation of being seen without the material conditions for being known. The loneliness crisis is not evenly distributed. The data is specific about where it is concentrated, and the patterns are not the ones public conversation is comfortable with. The 2024 American Enterprise Institute report by Daniel Cox and Samuel Pressler found that 24% of Americans with a high school diploma or less report having no close friends, compared to 10% of college graduates. Among Black Americans without a college degree, the figure is 35%. The educational stratification of the friendship gap is among the largest in the data. The Harvard Making Caring Common survey from May 2024 found that Americans earning less than $30,000 per year were the loneliest income group. 29% reported feeling lonely frequently or always, compared to 18% of those earning over $100,000. The loneliness is not distributed by income in a linear way. The gradient is steepest at the bottom. The American Psychiatric Association survey from 2024 found that 30% of Americans aged 18 to 34 reported feeling lonely at least several times a week. This is the youngest cohort of full adults. According to Our World in Data's analysis of American Time Use Survey data, young Americans aged 15 to 25 now spend approximately 6 hours per day alone, up from 4 hours per day in 2010. That is a 50% increase in solitude in 13 years, with no recovery after the pandemic. Their time with friends, specifically, has declined faster than their time with family. The Northwestern Medicine study published in April 2024 found that loneliness follows what researchers described as a U-shaped distribution across the lifespan, higher in adolescence, declining through middle age, rising again in older adults. This shape has long been documented. What is changing is the height of the curve at its early peak. The adolescent and young adult loneliness numbers are rising in ways that the U-shape's historical baseline did not predict. The McKenna-Plumley study published in BMC Psychology in November 2023, drawing on data from 225 adults aged 16 to 72, surveyed through Queen's University Belfast, found that 83% of participants reported having experienced what researchers defined as existential loneliness, the sense of fundamental separation from others and the world. This is loneliness not as a transient mood state. This is loneliness as an epistemological experience, the sense that one's inner reality is not accessible to and is not being accessed by any other person in one's social environment. 51% of participants in that same study knew the meaning of the term before accessing the survey. The concept has become legible enough to be named. The dominant causal narrative in the public health response to the loneliness epidemic focuses on structural factors, the decline of civic institutions, the housing crisis reducing neighborhood density, the rise of remote work, the smartphone. These explanations are not wrong. They describe real forces producing real changes in social architecture.
What they leave out is a mechanism that sits at the intersection of social behavior and cognitive habit, and that has been documented with increasing precision in the research literature, without ever receiving adequate attention in the public conversation. The mechanism is this. People have become systematically less practiced at the specific behaviors that generate mutual knowledge between individuals, and in many cases, less tolerant of the discomfort those behaviors require. Psychiatrist Daniel Knopfelmacher, assistant professor of clinical psychiatry and vice chair of education in psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medicine, has described the issue in terms of what he calls the normative social behavior of a social species. Normal human behavior, Knopfelmacher has said, favors frequent interactions with our family and our tribe throughout the day. The baseline behavioral repertoire of a social primate includes a continuous stream of low-stakes social contact, grooming behaviors, brief exchanges, shared meals, spontaneous proximity that functions as the substrate on which deeper knowledge of specific individuals is built. That behavioral repertoire is not something people consciously construct. It is something that structured social environments produce automatically. When those structured environments disappear, the behavior does not automatically persist. What persists, in many cases, is the higher-order social interaction, the dinner party, the planned outing, the scheduled call, without the baseline substrate. And the higher-order interaction without the substrate does not generate mutual knowledge at anywhere near the same rate. The research evidence for this comes from multiple directions. The Altman-Taylor social penetration theory, formalized in the early 1970s and consistently validated since, describes intimacy development as dependent on what it calls depth, the progressive disclosure of increasingly personal, vulnerable, identity-relevant information. The theory uses an onion metaphor. Each layer peeled back reveals something more central to who a person actually is. The process is gradual, reciprocal, and requires both the time and the contextual safety to proceed. A 2023 paper by Zain Jafar and colleagues in the loneliness literature described social media as a double-edged sword, capable of supporting genuine community formation in some circumstances while producing profound disconnection in others. The key variable, consistently, is whether the medium allows for the specific kind of graduated, reciprocal, vulnerable disclosure that intimacy research identifies as generative. Most social media architectures are not designed for that. They are designed for broadcast. Broadcasting is the structural opposite of the kind of graduated mutual revelation that produces being known. The specific behavioral failure is not that people do not want to be known. The data from the American Friendship Project found that 42% of Americans want closer friendships than they currently have. The gap is between desire and behavior, and between behavior and the structural conditions that make certain behaviors feel natural and safe. What is happening at a behavioral level is that the skills and habits of sustained mutual self-disclosure, the specific behaviors that, when practiced repeatedly in contexts of low stakes and high frequency, produce the experience of being genuinely known, are being used less often, in thinner contexts, with less structural reinforcement and with less normative support. The University of Virginia's Megan Costello study on vulnerable self-disclosure found that the ability to modulate self-disclosure appropriately, to open up when seeking support, to pull back when providing it, is a learned developmental skill, built through practice beginning in adolescence. When the practice opportunities decline, the skill atrophies. It is worth pausing here. The data on American adolescent in-person social time shows a 45% decline over 20 years, the critical developmental period for building the exact skills that determine whether adult relationships will generate mutual knowledge, is coinciding with a near halving of the social practice time in which those skills develop. That is not an accident waiting to happen. It has already happened. It is currently expressing itself in the young adult loneliness data. The research on this topic is deep, and the channel has covered related dimensions of the social disconnection crisis, including a dedicated episode on loneliness and physical health outcomes. If you haven't seen it, it's linked in the description. The argument to this point has a coherent structure, and it is worth confronting the evidence that complicates it before proceeding to where the data leads. The first complication comes from the Natalie Pennington American Friendship Project data itself. Pennington and colleagues, drawing on national samples of nearly 6,000 adults from 2022 and 2023, found that only 1.8% of respondents considered themselves friendless when allowed to define friendship broadly. 75% of participants said they were satisfied with the number of friends they had. The average American adult reported having 4 or 5 friends, comparable to figures from 1970 through 2015. This is not the data of a society that has stopped forming relationships. It is the data of a society that has formed relationships that are not delivering the specific relational provision that produces the experience of being known. Pennington herself drew attention to the value of what she called weak ties, casual friends, acquaintances, regulars, noting that even lower intimacy contact helps meet goals of companionship and stress reduction. This is an important corrective to the narrative that only deep intimacy counts. Companionship and reduced stress are genuine goods. They are also not the same as being known. The second complication involves the question of whether the loneliness crisis is genuinely novel or whether it reflects a measurement artifact, a greater willingness in 2024 to report feelings that were equally prevalent in earlier eras but less legible or socially acceptable to name. This is a serious methodological concern. Several researchers have raised it. The available data cannot definitively settle it, partly because consistent longitudinal measurement of the specific kind of relational poverty being described here, the gap between social embeddedness and mutual knowledge, does not exist going back more than a few decades.
What the data can establish is that the structural conditions for mutual knowledge development have demonstrably declined. Less in-person time, less spontaneous contact, less context diversity in social encounters, more mediated interaction. If those structural conditions produce the experience of not being known, the conditions for that experience are objectively worsening. Whether the subjective experience itself is equally novel or was always widespread and unacknowledged is a genuinely unresolved question. Both possibilities have troubling implications, but for different reasons. The third complication is the most important one. The research on what actually generates mutual knowledge, graduated self-disclosure, context-diverse repeated contact, the willingness to be genuinely vulnerable, consistently shows that these behaviors are not uniformly difficult. They are difficult in specific structural conditions. When institutions provide the scaffolding, when environments provide the repeated contact, when norms provide the permission, people disclose and develop knowledge of each other with relative ease. The implication is that the barrier is not fundamentally psychological, it is structural, which means it is, in principle, changeable. That is not a silver lining. The structures that would need to change are deeply embedded in the current organization of work, housing, transportation, technology, and civic life. Changing them is not the equivalent of individual people choosing to have more vulnerable conversations, though that would help on a small scale. The scale of the structural change required is large. The Surgeon General's 2023 advisory was issued not because of a philosophy of connection, it was issued because the health data had crossed a threshold that public health institutions are designed to respond to. Social isolation and loneliness, the advisory stated, increase the risk of premature death by 26 to 29%. The mortality impact is equivalent, according to the advisory's own framing, as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. People who are chronically lonely are more than twice as likely to develop depression. Loneliness increases the risk of heart disease, stroke, and dementia. Social isolation in older adults accounts for an estimated $6.7 billion in additional Medicare spending annually. A 2024 Harvard study published in the American Heart Association journals found that people reporting persistent loneliness had a 56% higher risk of experiencing a stroke compared to those without reported loneliness. The economic toll of loneliness in the United States has been estimated at $406 billion annually in workplace absenteeism and lost productivity, according to figures cited in the loneliness public health literature. This number is contested and difficult to calculate cleanly, but no serious analyst of the underlying data disputes the direction of the effect or its magnitude. What these numbers describe, when taken together, is a condition that is killing people at a rate that public health institutions would not accept from any other preventable exposure. The cigarette comparison is not rhetorical, it is a precise statement about mortality risk. The United States government spent decades and billions of dollars developing, implementing, and enforcing policies to reduce tobacco use precisely because that level of excess mortality was judged to be unacceptable. The loneliness advisory was issued in 2023. As of 2024, 1 in 5 American adults still reports feeling lonely every day. There is a force driving the specific variant of the loneliness crisis, the gap between being present and being known, that the public health and social science literature consistently fails to name directly, possibly because naming it requires engaging with the economic logic of the technology platforms that have become the primary infrastructure of American social life. Social media platforms are not designed to maximize mutual knowledge between their users. They are designed to maximize engagement, a metric that is operationally defined as time on platform, content interaction, and return visits. These outcomes are best served by architectures that make people feel seen and responded to at high frequency, notifications, likes, comments, follower counts, while structuring interaction in ways that are broadcast-oriented, context-thin, and optimized for rapid consumption rather than graduated mutual revelation. The specific behaviors that generate mutual knowledge, long, uninterrupted conversation, shared context across time and multiple situations, graduated disclosure of vulnerability in an environment of low stakes, are behaviors that do not generate platform engagement at the scale the advertising model requires. They are, in fact, structurally opposed to platform engagement. Deep mutual knowledge, once achieved, reduces the need to be on the platform. It redirects social energy towards the specific person who knows you, away from the broadcast audience who has seen you. This is not a conspiracy. It is a market incentive operating with considerable precision on the architecture of social life. The platforms are not attempting to make people lonely, they are attempting to maximize engagement. Loneliness, in the specific form of craving more surface contact with a larger broadcast audience, is an engine of engagement. It keeps people coming back. It is not in any platform's business interest to solve it, even though several platforms have made rhetorical gestures towards doing so. John Cacioppo, the late neuroscientist at the University of Chicago who dedicated his career to understanding loneliness and belonging, argued in his research, conducted across decades before his death in 2018, that human beings derive strength not from individualism, but from what he called our collective ability to plan, communicate, and work together. Cacioppo's neuroscience demonstrated that loneliness is not merely an emotional state, it is a physiological one, activating threat response systems in the brain, elevating cortisol, disrupting sleep, and initiating a feedback loop in which lonely people become more vigilant for social threat, more likely to interpret ambiguous signals negatively, and therefore becoming increasingly less capable of the openness that genuine mutual knowledge requires. That feedback loop, loneliness producing cognitive patterns that make the specific behaviors required to exit loneliness more difficult, is the least discussed feature of the current data. The conditions are not merely failing to produce mutual knowledge, they are actively, for a significant subset of the population, producing states that make mutual knowledge harder to develop even when structural opportunities are present.
This is the mechanism that turns a social problem into a public health crisis. Not just that the conditions for connection have eroded, but that the erosion produces neurobiological states that worsen the condition in the individuals experiencing it. The current public conversation about loneliness focuses overwhelmingly on interventions at the level of individual behavior and community programming, building more parks, encouraging people to call friends more often, designing neighborhoods for walkability, creating social prescribing programs in clinical settings. These are not useless. Some of them have evidence bases.
None of them addresses the specific structural feature that is driving the most rapidly worsening dimension of the problem: the progressive elimination from the architecture of daily American life of the repeated, unscheduled, context diverse, low stakes encounters with the same people across time that are the material conditions for developing mutual knowledge. The question the data is pointing toward, and that public conversation is conspicuously not engaging with, is what happens to a society in which a growing fraction of the population reaches adulthood having never developed the specific skills and habits of graduated self disclosure, contextual legibility across situations, and the tolerance for relational vulnerability that mutual knowledge requires. The skills are developmental. They are built in adolescence through practice. The practice time has declined by 45% in 20 years. The adults who emerge from that developmental environment do not simply have fewer opportunities to be known, they have less practiced the very behaviors that produce being known. They are, in a specific sense, less capable of it, not by nature, but by developmental circumstance. There is no large-scale longitudinal data yet that directly measures the relationship between reduced adolescent in-person social practice time and adult relational capacity for mutual knowledge development. The cohorts that grew up in the smartphone era are only now reaching their late 20s and early 30s. The 2024 loneliness data showing that 30% of adults aged 18 to 34 feel lonely several times a week or more is the early leading edge of that cohort's relational experience expressing itself in the survey data. The trajectory is visible. What happens next at the population level when those cohorts constitute the majority of the adult workforce, the majority of parents, the majority of caregivers, is genuinely unknown. The public health literature on loneliness has documented the health effects of the condition with considerable precision. It has not yet modeled the second order effects of a society in which mutual knowledge, the experience of being genuinely known by another person, becomes a statistical rarity rather than an ordinary expectation of adult social life. While Cornell's Knopfmacher put it plainly, we are a social species. But it's not sentiment, it is evolutionary biology. Homo sapiens evolved in environments where survival was contingent on belonging to a group that knew you well enough to rely on you and for you to rely on them. The neurobiological apparatus for loneliness, the pain response, the threat activation, the cortisol elevation, the sleep disruption, exists precisely because being unknown to one's group was, for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, a death sentence. The system is working as designed. It is signaling danger because the conditions it evolved to detect are present. What the data has not yet established, and what would be necessary to know in order to understand the full social consequence, is the feedback between declining mutual knowledge and the political, civic, and institutional trust that is the macroscopic expression of a society's capacity for collective action. Putnam documented the relationship between social capital, the density of reciprocal knowledge and obligation in a community, and institutional performance in his 1993 book, Making Democracy Work. His data, drawn from Italian regional governments, showed that the regions with the densest civic associational life produced the most functional government institutions. The causal mechanism was mutual knowledge, people who knew each other well enough to hold each other accountable for their obligations to shared institutions. If that mechanism is correct, then what the loneliness data is describing is not only a public health crisis, it is the early expression of a civic crisis. The depletion of mutual knowledge at the interpersonal level and the depletion of institutional trust at the civic level are not separate phenomena running in parallel. They are the same phenomenon operating at different scales. These episodes are free to watch, but not free to make. If you want this kind of analysis to continue, the channel membership link is in the description, and sharing this video with one person who would find it valuable is worth more than any algorithm boost. The strongest available objection to the argument being made here is that it romanticizes a past in which people were also extensively lonely, extensively unknown to each other, extensively isolated by the rigidities of class, race, gender, and geography, and simply had fewer tools to express or measure that experience. The nostalgic reconstruction of mid-century American civic life as a period of rich mutual knowledge is, on this account, a misleading baseline. The objection has genuine force. The civic associational life that Putnam documented in decline was not uniformly available to all Americans. Black Americans in the Jim Crow South were not embedded in the same dense community structures as white Americans in the suburban Midwest. Women's civic participation was heavily constrained by legal and social norms. The bowling leagues and PTAs of the 1950s existed alongside profound structural exclusions that made genuine mutual knowledge across lines of race and gender structurally impossible in large parts of the country. The objection is correct. The historical baseline is contaminated. The present crisis cannot be evaluated against a romanticized past. But the objection does not neutralize the argument, it merely changes its form. The question is not whether the past was better, the question is whether the specific structural conditions for mutual knowledge development are currently declining for the specific populations that the loneliness data identifies as most affected. The AEI data shows that 24% of Americans without a college degree report no close friendships. The Harvard data shows that lonely adults report not being able to share their true selves with anyone. The ATUS data shows that in-person social time has declined most sharply among exactly the populations that are now showing the highest loneliness rates. The structural decline is real. The distributional unfairness is real. Both can be true simultaneously, and the second does not cancel the first. The United States government spent $1.5 trillion in defense in fiscal year 2024. It declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023. The advisory was 82 pages. There is no line item. The aggregate picture is this. A large and growing fraction of the American adult population exists inside social networks that are structurally inadequate to produce the specific relational experience, being genuinely known by another person, that the evolutionary and psychological evidence identifies as a fundamental human need. The mechanisms producing this condition are multiple, mutually reinforcing, and operating at a scale and pace that individual behavioral interventions cannot address at population level. The specific form this loneliness takes, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who do not actually know you, is harder to measure than the loneliness of physical isolation, harder to name, and harder to treat, precisely because the people experiencing it are not obviously, publicly, visibly alone. They are at the dinner table. They are in the meeting. They are married. They are on the group chat. The absence is interior. The social form is present. The relational substance has evacuated from it. The 57% of lonely adults in the Harvard Making Caring Common 2024 survey who said they were unable to share their true self with anyone around them, those are not people in empty apartments. They are people in full lives. They are surrounded. They are unknown. What the data has not yet established with precision is the threshold. The question is not whether this condition is worsening. The BLS data, the Gallup data, the AEI data, the Harvard data, the Time Use Survey data, they all converge on the same direction. The question is whether there is a point at which the depletion of mutual knowledge across a society becomes self-reinforcing in ways that existing public health and civic interventions cannot reverse. The John Cacioppo's research identified the neurobiological feedback loop. Loneliness activates threat systems that make the behaviors necessary to exit loneliness harder to perform. The same dynamic operates at a social scale. A society with insufficient mutual knowledge produces institutions that are less trusted, less functional, and less capable of generating the collective action required to rebuild the structural conditions for mutual knowledge. The feedback is not inevitable, but the data does not suggest it is being interrupted. There is a specific question that the evidence makes most consequential, and it is this. When the developmental cohort that grew up with 50% less in-person social practice time enters middle age, when the people who are currently 18 to 30 become the caregivers, the civic leaders, the parents of the next generation, what will their capacity for mutual knowledge look like? What will they be able to give to the people who need them to know them? The data does not answer that question yet. The cohort is young. The trajectory is visible. The evidence for what that trajectory produces has not fully arrived. Whether the next generation will be defined by an epidemic of loneliness is not the most precise formulation of the risk. They already are. The precise question is whether they will also be the first generation in which not being known becomes not a temporary condition to escape from, but the expected texture of adult life. That question has an answer. It will take about 20 years to become fully visible in the data. The numbers describe a condition. The condition has a name. The name does not capture the specificity of what it feels like to stand in a full room and be invisible to everyone in it, not because they cannot see you, but because seeing is not the same as knowing, and knowing requires conditions that the current architecture of social life is not producing. The mechanisms are structural, the trajectory is documented, the feedback loops are identified. What is missing is the intervention at a scale commensurate with the problem. The data does not resolve the question of whether that intervention will come. It is clear about what happens if it doesn't.